Larry, about 200% of your time.
Mark's on his way. They're transferring my reservation at Ohio State. Because they were sold out at the Hyatt, so he's taking over my reservation for the student conference.
Okay, let's get started. Let's get started. Let me have your attention, please. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is Mrs. Angelina Howard. She is the Executive Vice President in charge of Member Relations and External Affairs for the Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington, D.C. Angie received a B.S. From Clemson University in 1969. She also attended the Harvard Business School in 1986 and in Advanced Management School at Harvard. She also attended a short course on reactor technology at MIT in 1994. After her graduation from Clemson in 1969, she joined Duke Power, and she was with Duke Power from 1969 to 1980. In 1980, she joins the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations when it began in 1980, and she was with INPO for 16 years until 1996. And then in 1996, she joined the Nuclear Energy Institute in D.C., and she's been there ever since. She's a friend, and she has helped a lot of our students, and we're glad that she's here today. Her topic is the nuclear workforce now and in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miss Angelina Howard.
Thank you, Dr. Dodds, Lee, and it's my pleasure to be here today. It's great to come back to Knoxville, where I've been on several of occasions, and see your small part of your pretty campus. And also, but most importantly, is to be here with you, with the department, and the students that are here in the department, because you are our future in nuclear, and what I want to talk about is your future in nuclear. I will say to you, and what I'll plan to do today is give you a short commercial about NEI, just very quickly, but I think it's important that you know who we are and how we can help you. I want to talk a little bit about how the industry is operating today, the progress that we're seeing in the industry, and also talk a little bit about our challenges that we face, because we always are going to face challenges, but some exciting things about the future of the industry and the role that our workforce issues and people such as yourselves play in that. Let me start by talking about the Nuclear Energy Institute. We really are the policy organization for the commercial nuclear energy and nuclear technologies industries. We deal with all things nuclear that are technologies, and that goes from mining of uranium, it goes to the production facilities, our power plants around the country. It means the back end of the fuel cycle, but it also means other commercial applications, in particular radiopharmaceutical applications. And so we represent the industry, and we try to formulate the policies that promote the beneficial uses of nuclear energy, both in our country and really worldwide, and to provide a forum that helps to resolve the technical, regulatory, and business issues for the nuclear business. We gather our operations from the member companies. We don't have individual memberships. That's the American Nuclear Society. But we have corporate memberships. And so all of the U.S. nuclear utilities that own and operate nuclear power plants are members. We have quite a number of international membership within NEI. But the plant designers, the architect engineering firms, as I said, the radiopharmaceuticals, fuel suppliers, universities, and the University of Tennessee is a member, I'm pleased to say. Labor unions, and we even let lawyers and law firms be a part of our organization, because all of that is what it takes to have a successful commercial industry. The strength of NEI, though, comes from the members and the people who work for the member companies. we have roughly 120 employees at NEI, but we have 270 corporate members. And we work on issues. We work on technical issues, we work on political issues, and we work on public policy issues. And the way we get things done is that at most any one time we could have anywhere between 1,400 and 1,500 people actively engaged in resolving issues for the industry. So that's how we really operate on a day in, day out basis. The status of our, and I'm going to focus today primarily on nuclear power plant operation because I think that's where the crux of the industry really is. But when you talk about nuclear power plant operation, you've got to realize that it takes everything from the fuel coming out of the ground to what are you doing with the waste product that's a part and supporting a nuclear power plant operation. We have 103 operating units today, one major refurbishment that's going on right here in the Tennessee Valley area down at Browns Ferry in Alabama. Our average capacity factor over the last 4 years, over 90%. Today, nuclear energy generates 20% of our electricity in the United States. When you think about 20%, it means a little more to me when I say we generate the electricity for 1 of every 5 homes and businesses in this country. That's a big part of our energy supply. It's 70% of our emission-free generation in this country. Wind energy represents about 1%, solar about 1%. And most importantly, too, from a clearly environmental advantage, it represents the elimination or the prevention of some 700 million tons a year of greenhouse gases into our environment. Let's talk a little bit about this performance. Here we have really over 90% capacity factor. This is really world-class performance. And we saw it start to build in the late 1980s. Part of this, as the industry started addressing this, was the question of what would we do as the industry was looking at a restructuring, a deregulation of the industry. Was the industry going to be prepared to compete? And a lot of effort was made by the industry in the late 1980s time frame to reassess the performance of the industry and where they were going. A lot of work went into that. Things like addressing outage management, things like really addressing the high performance that we were seeing in other parts of the world and bringing those lessons learned back to the industry here in this country. So we've seen the exceptionally high capacity factors over time, and that's why this performance of the industry is really at a high class level, and it's been sustained. And as we see the sustaining levels of production, and that adds to the same aspects that we've done in looking at the economic performance of our plants. The economic performance of nuclear for many years has been the lowest cost base load or lowest cost power generation from the existing reactor fleets. That's very important, and we've seen this sustained. One of the things about nuclear is that it is not subject to the wildly fluctuations that we see particularly in the oil and gas markets. And so this is your oil and gas. Coal is down a little further. Pretty stable supplies from coal standpoint as well, but nuclear has been able to continue. And because the cost of nuclear, some of the lower cost of the fuel cost, that makes it a less impacted, less volatile, and a stable supply going forward. And that's very important as we plan for the future. We saw that capacity factor chart, and this really is, over the last decade, you've seen the increased output from our nuclear units in this country. It's the equivalent to an additional 18 1,000 megawatt electric generating plants coming on the line in this country. So when you hear people say, well, you haven't built a nuclear plant in a long time in this country, and that's true, we haven't ordered and we haven't built, and we'll talk a little bit more about future plants in a minute, but a level of performance that we've seen from our existing fleet is the equivalent of 18 1,000 megawatt units. And it has continued to satisfy a high percent of the growth in electricity demand over that same time frame. In fact, the nuclear industry the nuclear plants in this country have been generating 20% of our electricity demand for about 20 years. And as the demand has grown, the output has grown, and we've been able to maintain that. But going much beyond the 91% capacity factors that we're seeing today is not going to be something that's going to be easily accomplishable. But we'll talk about how we'll add to some generation going forward. The question on competitiveness always comes up, and it's this chart. I'd like to just point out there are two comparisons here, but it gives you a sense. The yellow bars actually compare different regions of the country, the Northeast, California, Mid-Atlantic. And these are bus bar cost of generating electricity as it goes onto the grid. And here you see some comparisons of the clearing prices of electricity. We've averaged here a gas-fired plant, and this is fuel cost only. Gas plants are lower capital costs, but the fuel cost is a significant driver with a natural gas plant. And this is your estimated nuclear bus bar cost, on average around the country at $23. So that's clearly competitive. Now, in a restructured market, if it's the Mid-Atlantic or if it's California, and the going price of electricity is in the $38 to $40, and you're selling your nuclear electricity into that market at $23. I mean, you're generating into that market at 23, but you're selling at 43. That's a significant income producer for the company that's doing that. So it's clearly competitive. And in fact, in most cases, as we dispatch electricity around the country, nuclear is usually your first order of dispatch. And what that means is when the dispatchers who are saying, I need electricity, nuclear often is the first that's put on the line. It is base load. It runs 24/7 for that very reason right there from an economic standpoint. The only thing that usually dispatches ahead of nuclear is run-of-the-river hydro, or the hydro that's got to be coming through the turbines because of rainfall or other reasons for that particular type of generation. So clearly competitive today. That's from our existing plants. And we'll talk a little bit about competitiveness for future plants in a moment. And lastly, I have to talk about the environmental benefits that we see from nuclear. Increased demand is a major factor in this country, but we also want to see about how we keep our air clean and our waters clean. This chart actually shows the environmental benefits, and it's really dealing only with carbon. You can show similar types of charts from the standpoint of air pollutants, controlled pollutants such as sulfur dioxide and nitric oxides. But clearly from the U.S. program that we have that's operated by the Department of Energy, it is a voluntary program. Nuclear represents 35% of the carbon reduction program that we have that DOE runs in this country. This is where we actually file data with the NRC, and that's compared to what the alternatives would be if the nuclear plants were not in operation. So in fact what you're saying is that we are preventing this amount of carbon and other greenhouse gas pollutants going into the atmosphere. The program itself is aiming to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity from our gross domestic product in the United States by 18% by the year 2012. And what we've been able to do in committing with the rest of the electricity industry is to represent roughly 10% of the President Bush's goal in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and this is because of the large component that nuclear can afford to that program. And certainly that goes to be a key aspect as we look forward in the future, as energy policy and environmental policy are starting to merge in our country and in our Congress. The clean air benefits of nuclear play a key role in that. We're seeing continued progress with license renewal of our existing fleet as well. License renewal, when it was first proposed in the early 1990s, was a question of how can we really look at the components in our nuclear facilities and understand how long will they last. And one of the things we've learned is that some of the major components aren't going to last 40 years. That was one of the first questions. How are some of the major pumps and major components lasting 40 years? Well, we found out they don't. And we learned very quickly and promptly how to change out large components in our nuclear facilities. And now we routinely, well, not routinely, but we do change out the large steam generators in the pressurized water reactors and the reactor vessel heads and large piping and pump components. So by the time we develop the process for license renewal, what you really are determining are really the passive safety systems of the facilities. And we have a discipline program that's been established and developed with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for reviewing and granting license renewal. And it looks both not only at the safety systems within the plant, but also the environmental impact. To date, we've had 30 of the 103 units achieve license renewal, which is an extension of 20 years for a total of 60 years on the cycle. There are 18 that are already under review at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and 22 have identified to the NRC that they intend to file. And so that's roughly half of the units to date, a little more than half of the units to date, and we really expect all of the units, essentially all of the units, to go forward with license renewal. 4 years ago, when Calvert Cliffs, which was the first one, became the first one to renew its license, it still was a novel concept. Today, license renewal has become part of a regular and routine licensing amendment, if you will, with the industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I expect and I hope that 10 years from now, that the idea of issuing a combined construction and operating license for new nuclear plants won't be a novel concept, but will be similarly routine, and we'll talk a little more about that. We have seen, though, steady increases in our nuclear capacity, not new plants come on the line, but when our plants were designed, there were a number of conservatisms that were put into the design. And as we've operated them, and as we've also looked at new equipment, we've seen that we've been able to get additional uprates to the capacity at the plants, either through equipment change out or through design of the fuel and the steam flows. And so in the last 4 years, we've added approximately 2,300 megawatts of power uprates at our existing plants, and there's some 1,100 megawatts that are under NRC review right now. So that's added to the capacity factor. And then I mentioned Browns Ferry early, but the TVA project to restart the Browns Ferry Unit 1 that was shut down in the 1980s is about halfway complete. It's on schedule and within budget, from what I understand from TVA, and really is an example of a unit in startup in this country. And that's exciting. It's exciting for the folks at TVA who are working on that. And we'll bring back in close to 1,000 megawatts of capacity to our system. So there's a lot of work that's going on in adding capacity. We've seen steady improvement in public opinion toward nuclear energy as well. NEI has tracked public opinion for a number of years, asking the same question of, do you favor or oppose the use of nuclear energy? And so we see now really in the latest survey that was done in October of last year, some of the highest figures that we've seen all along. It's clear that the public favorability has never been higher, and that the spread of those who don't favor it is also going down. But we try to also ask the public, when we do these pollings, some additional questions as well. And so the support is not just abstract or theoretical. 80% think nuclear power is important for our energy future, and 67% favor the use of nuclear energy. 71% want to keep the option open to build new nuclear plants in the future, while 60% say that we definitely should build new nuclear plants in the future, and 62% would accept a new nuclear plant at a nearby plant to them that is already operating. So we try to go down and query that public opinion. If you're looking at a political race, a 60% from a political candidate is a shoo-in. And we know that we'll have challenges, but seeing those stronger numbers and continuing to see those numbers grow are important as a factor as we look toward building new plants. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that the industry is facing and has faced over the last year. Certainly since September 11th, 2001, the aspect of security and security at our existing nuclear fleets has been one that has received extreme scrutiny. At the time of the terrorist attacks in our country, our industry, the nuclear commercial industry, was one industry that actually had formidable security already in place. We are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on security, and security had been increasing at our plants prior to 9/11 due to conditions that we were seeing around the world. After 9/11, quite a number of additional measures have been taken. An investment of over $1 billion in security-related improvements at the 64 sites. Those capital expenditures involved extending and fortifying the security perimeters, installing new barriers to protect against potential vehicle bombs, and installing additional high-tech surveillance equipment at the barriers and at entrances to the plants. We've increased the size of the security forces at the plants by 60% to approximately 8,000 officers that are dispersed around the commercial power plants around the country. And essentially they are similar to a paramilitary force. Since that we have a train that goes by periodically.
Every week.
Every week. Okay. Will that prevent the picking up on the... Okay. The NRC also has looked at security very seriously and twice increased the definition of the threat that the industry must protect and ensure protection against. And as a result, the nuclear plants now are able to defend against a greater number of attackers, armed with more weapons and more sophisticated weapons than ever before. And the industry successfully implemented new regulations extended by the NRC the end of last October. One of the things that the industry has taken an initiative in, though, is to not only work with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but also with the Department of Homeland Security, our national department that's responsible for protecting citizens against terrorism and terrorist activities. And we've created a Nuclear Sector Coordinating Council to ensure that the industry initiatives are closely integrated with those other initiatives that the Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies are taking, not only toward the nuclear industry, but other particularly infrastructure industries, the chemical industry and other industries in our country. These initiatives, working together with the Department of Homeland Security, are both to demonstrate what our industry has already done and to help Department of Homeland Security understand what is capable and important for other infrastructure industries to pay attention to and to perhaps go forward. And quite frankly, we feel that the nuclear industry has done enough right now, and we need some stability both from the regulatory process and the federal process to be able to assimilate all of these changes that we've taken place in the plant and assimilate that into the operations of the plant. And we want to take the time in our industry to do that while the federal government is actually catching up with some of the other industries. But we'll continue to work and integrate with the federal, state, and local government and law enforcement agencies to ensure that our facilities maintain a strong and defensible facility that ensures that public health and safety will not be impacted. A second challenge that we deal with is what are we going to do with the used nuclear fuel as it completes its use in the reactors in our country? How are we developing the repository, the national repository? And that national repository is at Yucca Mountain, Nevada. In 2002, the presidential decision was made, and the Congress upheld that decision in votes in the Congress, and it's the law of the land to develop the Yucca Mountain site as a suitable underground repository for the used nuclear fuel. There were a number of court challenges by the state of Nevada and other groups against not only the Department of Energy's guidelines for choosing the site, the constitutionality of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the Environmental Protection Agency guidelines for radiological control, and many other cases. And those cases were consolidated, and the rulings last July were largely in favor of the industry of the government. There was one ruling in those cases, though, that questioned how the Environmental Protection Agency developed the radiation standard that the Yucca Mountain project would have to meet over a 10,000-year process, and whether or not the 10,000 years was an appropriate level of time based on recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences. The court said to the EPA, you've chosen 10,000 years because you've based that on other types of hazardous materials facilities that you've licensed in the past. However, the National Academy of Sciences estimated that the time of peak dose, which would be when any and all accommodations had failed at the Yucca Mountain site, and radioactive material could leach out and into the groundwater and expose an individual adjacent to the site to 15 millirems of radiation a year. That time of peak dose could be as many as 300 to 400,000 years. Why didn't you consider a facility for 300 to 400,000 years? I see a couple of you smiling. You know, 300,000 years is 30 ice ages. Even to think and to be credible at 10,000 years is pretty much of a stretch. And remember that the exposed person is a subsistence farmer that takes all of their nourishment and never leaves that site and can't receive more than 15 millirem per year. So it's a pretty strong standard and a little bit of a far-fetched, but the program had been developed. The court said to EPA, you ought to think about that, or you ought to go back and ask Congress to define the 10,000 years to resolve the issue like they've done in other cases, or make your decision. So that's what the process that we're in right now on that particular standard. It is holding up one aspect of filing a license application, the Department of Energy filing a license application for the Yucca Mountain site with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They're also responsible to get the Licensing Support Network, which is a network of all of the documents that will be used in the licensing proceedings, complete and ready before they can file the license application. We expect the EPA to make some determination on the standard, and we also expect the Congress to make some decisions about whether or not they will get involved in this over the remainder of this year. But we feel like the DOE will be able to go ahead with a license application by the end of this year, and that's very important that they need to do so. Project funding. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which was passed in 1982, required that the utilities that are generating electricity using nuclear energy charge their customers a tenth of a cent per kilowatt hour of electricity generated from nuclear. And that is paid into what's called the Nuclear Waste Fund. So over the course of that time, we now have had consumers of electricity using nuclear energy contribute roughly $23 billion into what's called the Nuclear Waste Fund. Now, about $7 billion of that has been spent in the 20 years of scientific study that's gone on at Yucca Mountain. But the Congress has to appropriate the money each year for Yucca Mountain. They don't have access to the Nuclear Waste Fund to take the monies that the public pays to the federal government for the development of Yucca Mountain to spend it on Yucca Mountain. And each year, political influences from the state of Nevada have worked hard to try to lower the amount of appropriations. For example, in this year, there's only about $150 million from the Nuclear Waste Fund, even though the utilities are contributing roughly $750 million a year being used for Yucca Mountain. Now, where I come from, that's called stealing. Out of the way we operate our federal budget, they're calling it offsetting the deficit. So one piece of work that we do have underway this year and next year in the Congress is to change the way the classification of the Nuclear Waste Fund and how it applies to the federal budget is determined, so that those monies that consumers pay are spent on what the consumers pay and they get what they pay for. So that's another challenge that we have to do, because quite frankly, some in Congress like having that little bit of extra money that they can put somewhere else. So it's a fairness issue. And lastly, we continue to have a challenge with the state of Nevada. The state of Nevada continues to fight this project, and I understand that citizens in the state of Nevada would prefer not to have a high-level waste repository in their state. And yet when you ask the citizens of Nevada, over 87% think that the project is inevitable, and they would like to receive benefits from the federal government, which are allowed for in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, in order to accept and be the host for the Yucca Mountain project. What we are working on again, and are seeing a groundswell in Nevada of citizens who are saying, why are we spending millions of dollars to fight the project when we could participate constructively, ensure that the project is designed and constructed and will be operated with minimal impact on public health and safety, and let's go forward and have some benefits that come to our state. So all of those are dynamics that are at play as we go forward with the Yucca Mountain program, but we've seen continued progress. I think there'll continue to be fits and starts, but over time I think we'll see this project developed, and we will start shipping fuel from reactor sites around the country, primarily by train, but shipping to Yucca Mountain within the next decade. Those issues are important as we start now, and have started over the last several years, thinking about, are we going to build new nuclear plants in our country? There's a groundswell of support, and what's fueling that groundswell of support? One, some of the fundamentals of the electric power business are driving it. Political leaders as well as utility leaders are recognizing that the time is fast approaching when we're going to need new baseload generation in this country. Baseload generation is provided basically by two fuel sources, coal and nuclear. Today, that's what provides baseload generation, and that's what will provide it in the future. We will continue to look at renewables, and renewables will play a part, but their reliability and their capacity factor is such as that they will be peaking and midterm kind of load generation, not the base load generation. But the utility analysis and forecasting show that by the end of this decade, they need to start placing in service new base load generation. In the 12 years since we last passed energy policy legislation, we've built approximately 270,000 megawatts of new gas-fired generating capacity, but only 4,300 megawatts of new nuclear capacities come online, and only 9,500 megawatts of coal-fired capacity has come online. And even though nuclear and coal represent 70% of the today's supply, we recognize that there will be the continued reliance on natural gas cannot be sustained. And the policymakers are also coming to realize that there are higher uses for natural gas, particularly in our manufacturing sector in this country, and therefore it's time to look at new ways of supplying electricity, or new old ways of supplying electricity, rather than the continual reliance on natural gas that we've seen over the last few years. And the steadily and tightening environmental requirements on our carbon-based fossil fuels have been a factor in what's fueling the look at new nuclear. In nuclear power, the policymakers are seeing an emission-free, zero-carbon technology that can meet new electricity demand and at the same time provide some headroom under clean air emission caps that allow economic development to go forward without creating additional emissions from the electric generating sector. So the fuel and technology diversity is one of the core strengths of our electricity supply, and policymakers as well as utility executives see that nuclear is a key component in maintaining a fuel diversity makeup as we go forward and plan for the future. What the industry is doing about it, from an industry standpoint, we want to see the industry positioned so that when decisions need to be made in the next several years on baseload generation, that nuclear can be a component, can be a choice. Today, quite frankly, if we were looking to place an order today, we really don't have a design that's fully approved today to go forward to place that design. So what we've been trying to do is work with the vendors and work with the utility to do a large amount of the preliminary and preparatory work that are going to have to be done to establish the business case for new nuclear. So what we're trying to do is work with the NRC. There are new licensing concepts that were approved in 1992 in concept. We've been working over the last 5 years with the NRC to develop the licensing protocols, if you will, for these new standards, establishing their process for how they will inspect during construction to ensure facilities are built according to design, and looking at the kinds of financing approaches that will be necessary for the utilities, either whether they're in regulated space or non-regulated space as they go forward. There's a lot of work that has been done. In 1992, the Energy Policy Act established 3 new kinds of licensing processes. First of all, they approved what's called a design certification, where a vendor could apply to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and get pre-approval of a design. 3 designs have been certified by the NRC, but that was done in the 1990s time frame, and those designs truly are not economical in today's market. There are other designs. The Westinghouse AP1000 has gotten NRC approval and is awaiting certification. The General Electric small boiling water reactor, and Areva is also planning to co-file with NRC for their design that they're building in Europe. But design certification allows for approval of the design itself. And you get that approval and you can put that on the shelf. The second element is early site permits. We have 3 utilities with 2 more announcing intent, but 3 utilities who are actually in the licensing process with NRC today to test out an early site permitting process. This allows the company to go in with an envelope kind of design of maximum conditions and certify and actually license and get a permit to build that facility at a particular site. And that's good for 20 years. So you're getting pre-approval on your site, doing all the environmental work, and that permit should last for 20 years. And the third component is what I mentioned earlier, the combined construction and operating license. The plants that we operate today went through a convoluted process. They went through a lengthy licensing proceedings with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to get a construction permit. And as they built the plant, they finished the designs, and then they had to go in and get an operating license after the plant was essentially complete. Oftentimes, that was a protracted licensing process that took years, and at the time, the company was not getting a return on their investment. That's what drove up the price of plants, particularly those in the later, that came on late in the 1980s. So the whole idea is that you do all of your licensing up front before you invest major capital in the site and in the plant. So that's where we are. There are two consortiums of companies that are developing combined construction and operating license applications. This is being cost shared with the Department of Energy under the Nuclear Power 2010 program. Duke Power also has recently announced that they're going to go alone on a combined COL. What that does is that with cost sharing with DOE, you complete your first of its kind design and engineering for the entire project and then file an application with NRC. They hope to have the engineering complete by 2008 and file with the NRC for a combined construction operating license. And then the third initiative underway is TVA, along with General Electric and Toshiba, are doing a feasibility study at the Bellefonte site. That's also being funded by DOE for building a GE-type reactor there. So we have a lot of work that's underway now, testing out the process to make sure that we understand what is necessary under this licensing case. We also have a lot of work going on understanding what kind of financial incentives will be needed for the first few plants that are built. Because again, while we have this process, it's not been tested. And we need to make sure that there's not going to be some sort of unanticipated delay right at the plant going online. And that's the question that the financial community is asking before they're willing to finance the large amount of money that will take to build these facilities. So there's a lot of work underway trying to look at what is it going to take to stimulate that investment and ensure the process will go forward. And so what we're looking at is a limited amount of money for a limited number of units for a limited period of time to fully test that process out. And then we think the industry will have no trouble being competitive and going forward on its own. You know, in order to plan for the future of new plants, you've got to think about the future workforce. In fact, with those units that are already received license applications, license renewal extensions for those units, the workforce that will be working at those plants as they near the end of their 60 years are not even, in the workforce today, the individuals there. So it's important from an existing plant fleet, and it's very important from a new plant fleet. So what it means for you is that the industry does have a future, but we need now to plan how that workforce is going to go about. At NEI, we started looking right at early 2001 about trying to understand what the workforce needs are going to be. We surveyed at that time. We did a second survey in 2003 looking at the plants and suppliers and other key organizations and what their needs were and the dynamics of their workforce. We've just completed, we don't even have the data yet, a 2005 survey updating the 2003 survey so that we really understand, the nature of the beast. In 2001, we did looking at just what the demand for new workers were going to be over the next 10 years, and looking at where those requirements were going to come from. And we were looking at a lot coming from your government. That's the Department of Energy, that's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, national laboratories, but also our nuclear power plants, the engineering and design services, supplemental staffing for outages, and even the universities. There's a thin yellow line there again. But this is a lot of workers. This is over 90,000 workers that the industry told us they were going to need over the next 10 years to meet the workforce needs. We tried to look at that in key specific areas. And from this chart you can see that the real demand that we were going to see from the industry standpoint and the shortages potentially when degreed health physicists, nuclear engineers, and other engineers. Again, we're not talking huge numbers in the totality, but we've started to see some significant shortages. And quite frankly, I think the results of these studies were in some way attributable to university and DOE and other activities that got underway in the early part of this century that has seen some of the pickup in engineering and nuclear engineering enrollments that we have seen around the country. For a while there was a downturn and we've seen a pickup, and I think you've seen the same thing here and in other places. Maybe that's what drove some of you to get into the industry, and I want to hear from that as we go forward. The 2003 study, we tried to look at the age distribution because we really wanted to understand what the workforce looked like. And we found that it was essentially a bell-shaped curve, as you can see, with the largest number in the workforce at 43 to 53 years of age. The median age, and when you consider that retirement experience tells us that most people in the industry retire or can take retirement at age 55 with 25 years of service. And so that suddenly started to say, whoa, where are we going? And this chart looks ahead 5 years at both general attrition, which you would expect in a workforce, and potential retirees of 16,000 people over the next 5 years. This got our utilities attention quite definitely, and the vendors as well. But what this means to a young employee is that there's a long-term stable employment opportunities, there's opportunities for advancements with the retirements that are coming up, and there's opportunities for increased responsibility. And so this slide can say a lot to a lot of people. To a utility chief nuclear officer, it says, not only am I in this mix, but I've got to think about how I'm feeding this pipeline. And I think the other thing that it says, if you go back, is the small number of young people that have been hired over the last few years, or really over the last decade in the industry. And therefore, again, the need, and in fact, even some of our companies are facing the dilemma of having reductions in their workforce in some areas while they're hiring in other areas in order to bring the young people into the pipeline and give them the experience so that they can take over as this retirement and attrition continues. We asked our companies what were their recruiting challenges were. 63% cited minority candidates, 60% cited female candidates, and then you see on down the list. We also do a little range in looking at the median incomes for engineering specialties. Let me show you where for those that can't see, the nuclear engineer comes up right with petroleum engineering, but over the engineering disciplines. So again, if you kind of add these slides together in your head, we see that there's a need for people, and there's pretty good pay in the nuclear engineering ranks. Women in nuclear. We talked about the need for diversity. The recruiting challenges were the women and diversity challenges. Women are achieving in this industry, and they're at every level. We see CEOs and presidents with Madame Loujean at Areva in France, Ruth Shaw, CEO of Duke Power Company, site vice presidents at Exelon, Constellation, technical and plant managers and department managers at Diablo Canyon, Wolf Creek, a whole range of plant sites, department managers, senior reactor operators. So women are making a decided remark. Maybe some hold the image of Homer Simpson as the image of workers in the industry, but couldn't be further from the truth. Our employees are coming into the industry from the training that you get in places like UT and other places, and the training that you receive while you're in the industry make them truly nuclear professionals. The industry is actively recruiting women in this industry. We've had outreach at the Society of Women Engineers by doing a Nuclear Career Central, where not only NEI but our member companies have come together en masse to demonstrate the strength of the industry as well as job opportunities for women. We have a strong program in the U.S. Women in Nuclear with over 1,400 members. It's a premier network for women in all aspects of nuclear science and technology to work together, to come together and network and share. I would encourage you to both as young people and for the women in the room, because Lee asked me to specifically talk to you a little bit about that, is, how do you get started? You come to us with their internships. We have an internship clearinghouse on our webpage where our member companies put up and post their internships available, and you can find that as well. I think you need to be flexible. You need to be willing to take a risk. You need to be able to move. You need to be able to go to a different part of the country. You need to look for opportunities in operations. You're engineering students. Many of our new hires in operations, including plant operators, are engineering graduates. Maybe you want to work specifically in fuel design, and that's important, and you'll have a job there. But operations gets you the breadth of the technology, the systems engineering, the many things that you can learn about the totality of the operation, provide that career enhancement. It's not a lot of fun to work shifts in operations, but the foundation and background that would give you and the opportunities that would give you is something that I would encourage you to look at as a part of your career planning. I would also encourage you as part of your career planning to get comfortable doing things like this: public speaking, being a leader on a team, on your project teams that you have here, but within your university, with an A&S student section. I think there's a contingent going up over the weekend to the A&S Student Conference. Getting involved in your profession, getting involved in your community, getting involved in being an advocate of your industry. So all of that is very important. Let me close by reminding you that the U.S. needs more capacity. This is a forecast increase in the annual growth rate in electricity demand using a fairly conservative forecast and a little more aggressive forecast, but quite a bit more capacity needs by 2025. A lot of that has got to come from nuclear energy. We're in a better position now than we've ever been for future growth in this industry. We do have challenges that we're going to continue to work through as Yucca Mountain and the workforce initiatives and security. But we are working to make sure on an ongoing basis that our plants operate and continue to operate at the highest levels of safety and reliability, and that we set the stage for new nuclear plants to be built in the future. Thank you for letting me be with you, and I'd love to entertain your questions.
Okay, we have time for questions and comments, and if you have a question, I encourage you to please use the microphone, okay? We have a question and comment from the audience. Well, I have a question and comment while you think of a question and comment, okay? It really has to do with percentage of women in the workforce. And you may not know the number, but what percentage of our current nuclear workforce are women, and more in particular, what percentage of the 120 people at NEI are women?
Percentage at NEI is about 30%. Okay. In the management ranks, we have three officers, 2 vice presidents, and assistant secretary of the corporation are women out of 9 officers. So a little over 30% in that regard. In the industry, yes, it's lower. It's probably at the professional ranks, engineering and above, it's probably in the 9% range, though it's growing. Engineering technician, when you add the technicians in, it drops because of the numbers of technical craft and skill craft. But again, there are opportunities there, and we're seeing more and more women going into the skill craft area. But the supplemental workforce, the contracting workforce is almost predominantly male. But again, we want to see that grow, and the utilities are convinced. The companies want to see their workforce look like their community. And so that's an important goal for them across the board in their community. And so the diversity and female recruiting is very strong, and they're very committed to that.
I can add a piece of information. We currently have 190 students in this department, and 15% are women, which is more than the 9% in the industry. And,
Well, that'll help solve the problem.
that's right, and we're looking to increase that percentage. So do we have other questions or comments? Adam?
So, this is I have two kind of questions. How many SROs are women? What percentage, just ballpark?
Oh, I would say a small percentage are women, 2% maybe.
And when you had the graph of the cost per kilowatt, the bus bar cost, is that with? Did you amortize the building cost in that?
Yes.
Did you do it with a 40-year?
That is last year's cost. So some of that is in. Some of those units have gone through restructuring and refinanced their debt, and some of that is written off. So some of that is reflected in the current day. But for most of the others that are still under rate base and all, you do have their capital cost amortized in there.
Do we have other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, in the back.
When you talk about the survey, about 65% favors nuclear and 23% favors against it. What's the sample size you surveyed?
Generally, we survey a sample size of 1,000 adults across the country, and that's usually has a margin of error of 3%. We use a pollster that looks at that kind of interview sample. Some of our surveying also looks at opinion leader, where we again use the same kind of sample, but individuals who are college-educated voters, because it's a higher level of opinion leader kind of surveying.
I should add that the survey organization that NEI frequently uses is called Biscani and Associates, and the president and CEO of Biscani and Associates is Ann Biscani. In other words, it's a woman. She does a very good job. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Well, we're about ending on time. I do see, seems like we have new people every week that show up for our colloquium program. I should add that we only have one more next week, and that'll be the last one scheduled for this semester. But those new people that are here today, you may not know that we have a reception downstairs, and Angie will be down there, and the reception does have food. So I encourage all of you to come, and she'll be available to answer more questions and talk one-on-one. But before we adjourn, let's express our appreciation again to Angie for her presentation.
Thank you.
Really good. And maybe it's because you're from South.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we did it again. See you next week.
It's a challenge.